Hello, good morning, students. I welcome you in this lecture on the topic the role of metal ions in biological processes. So, in the past lecture, we went through the role of sodium, potassium in various biological processes. So, today, now we will focus on the sodium potassium pump. As you know that ATP, adenosine triphosphate, it stores energy for the cell in the form of free energy which can be released on hydrolysis of the POP phosphate bond of the phosphate polymer. So, this POP bond is formed by the condensation of two POH units with loss of water, and the reaction is controlled by pH and electrostatic charge. So, suitable pH and required charge gradient are created across the cell membrane by the reactions that exploit the electron acceptor properties of the oxygen molecule, which is ultimately responsible for building up the energy carrier of the cell. So, see here on the screen the high concentration gradient of sodium and potassium that exist across the cell membrane are maintained by the activity of an energy requiring pump, sodium potassium pump, which transports sodium out of the cell in exchange for potassium. As most of the animal cells, they have higher concentration of potassium ion inside the cell membrane than outside, and higher concentration of sodium outside the cell than inside. So, the energy for this pumping is provided by ATP generated during metabolic reactions in the cell. For example, in the erythrocyte cell, 3 sodium ions are pumped outward and 2 potassium ions inwards for each molecule of ATP hydrolyzed to ADP and inorganic phosphate. See here on the screen. Now we come to the working process. Okay. Here we see that जो sodium and potassium जो है, sodium potassium ATPase, it consists of 2 alpha beta subunits possessing cytoplasmic and extracellular domains respectively. So, each ATPase enzyme molecule binds sodium ion and hydrolyzes ATP to ADP on the cytoplasmic side of the membrane. यहाँ पे जो है, you see the next figure, that is this. ठीक है ना? तो it hydrolyzes the ATP to ADP on the cytoplasmic side of the membrane to pump out 3 sodium ion out of the cell and 2 potassium ion are transported into the cell. Now, since there is net movement of 1 positive charge outward per cycle, the sodium potassium pump is considered electrogenic in nature, and the net process can be represented as this. You have ATP plus H2O plus 3 sodium which are inside the cell plus 2 potassium ion outside the cell will give you ADP, okay, inorganic phosphate along with the water molecule, and 3 sodium ion are जो inside थे, they will be transported outside, and 2 potassium ion which were outside will be transported inside the cell. So, here you can see on the screen, I would like to describe you in a much more better way. देखिए, सोडियम पोटेशियम पंप में क्या है, आपको पता है कि सोडियम पोटेशियम पंप जो है, it is associated with the active transport of sodium and potassium across the cell membrane, right? तो with the possible exception of certain plant cells, बाकी सभी में सारी एनिमल सेल्स में आयन ट्रांसपोर्ट इज एसोसिएटेड विद फॉस्फोराइलेशन. ठीक है, अब आपको पता है कि जो सेल है, सेल मेम्ब्रेन की जो थिकनेस है, दैट इज़ अबाउट 70 एंगस्ट्रॉम थिकनेस होती है, एंड इट इज़ कंपोज्ड ऑफ डबल लेयर्स ऑफ प्रोटीन सेपरेटेड बाय लिपिड्स. तो कैटायंस तो जो है दे कैन नॉट पास थ्रू द लिपिड लेयर विदाउट एनकैप्सुलेशन, ठीक है ना। तो जो द एनक्लोज कैटायन, जो एनकैप्सुलेटेड कैटायंस हैं, दे प्रेजेंट एन ऑर्गेनिक लिपिड सॉल्युबल सरफेस टू द मेम्ब्रेन, जिसको कि बोलते हैं हम कैविटेंट्स, विच कैन पास थ्रू द सेल मेम्ब्रेन, ठीक है ना। तो most of the animal cells the concentration of potassium is about 0.14 mole and sodium की जो है it is about 0.01 mole. In fluids outside the cell the concentration of sodium is about 0.15 mole, reverse हो जाता है मतलब, and potassium is less than 0.0004 moles. तो maintenance of these large concentration gradient require a sodium pump. The energy of transport of ion is provided by the hydrolysis of ATP. Kidney and brain cells, they use about 70% of the energy from ATP for this transport, and in some cells each ATP molecule hydrolyzes transport of 3 sodium ion out of the cell as I told you earlier and 2 potassium ion into the cell. तो इस स्क्रीन पे आप इस डायग्राम को ध्यान से देखिए. द पोटेशियम इज रिक्वायर्ड इन द सेल फॉर ग्लूकोज मेटाबॉलिज्म, प्रोटीन सिंथेसिस एंड एक्टिवेशन ऑफ सम एंजाइम. The transport of glucose and amino acids into the cell is coupled with sodium transport, which is favored by greater concentration gradient. तो जो सोडियम एंटरिंग इनटू द सेल इन दिस वे मस्ट बी पम्प्ड आउट अगेन, उसको निकाले जाना भी बहुत ज़रूरी है. द कैरियर ऑफ द आयंस इज नाउ रिगार्डेड एज फॉस्फोप्रोटीन. क्या है, जिसमें कि एक फॉस्फेट जो है इट इज़ बाउंड टू अ serine group. So this phosphoprotein binds potassium. It has an affinity for potassium. It does not have affinity for sodium. On phosphorylation, it will bind sodium and not potassium. So this is the phosphorylation and dephosphorylation process basically. The phosphorylation and sodium binding occurs at the inner surface of the membrane ना, जहाँ पे कि ATP is getting converted into ADP, ठीक है ना, तभी तो आपको एनर्जी मिलेगी. The system is then transported to outer cell where it is undergoing dephosphorylation process, giving original phosphoprotein which releases sodium and now it binds potassium prior to its return to inner surface. ठीक है, तो इट इज़ देन फॉस्फोराइलेटेड है ना. पोटेशियम इज रिलीज्ड इनटू द सेल एंड सोडियम इज बाउंड टू इफ्लक्स फ्रॉम द सेल. तो इस तरह से एक रिवॉल्विंग डोर टाइप का मैकेनिज्म है ये, है ना. एंड द एनर्जी इन्वॉल्व इन पंप सिस्टम इज सोडियम पोटेशियम एक्टिवेटेड ATPase. When the outer cells are filled with potassium and the inner one with sodium concentration, a conformational change occurs rotating the site and alternating the site preference. ठीक है, तो देखिए यहाँ पे here you can see this diagram. This is the schematic diagram which is showing a much better mechanism of this sodium potassium pump. तो now this is a revolved door for transport of sodium and potassium in opposite direction and it is called eversion like motions through a revolving door. 3 sodium ion they are replaced by 2 potassium ion. The attachment of now potassium ion it triggers dephosphorylation process and the process it goes on like this. ठीक है ना. तो sodium potassium pump जो है it is nothing but the phosphorylation and dephosphorylation which is quite necessary to carry out the function of these sodium and potassium ion very well. Okay, now we will come to the role of calcium and magnesium in the next lecture. Goodbye.